talk I'm giving today has been modified a bit. It's based upon a talk I gave to the students at Otago University also about 3 weeks ago. The students, Generation Zero, the anti-lignite mining people, they invited me to give my doomest talk, and they would refute me, and they put up posters all around the university, and the poster said, "Cheer up, Bob." And it worked very well as a publicity campaign, because we filled St David's Lecture Theatre with over 500 students. And so this is the talk. So I start off looking at the doom and gloom that might happen in the world. But it's not cheer up, Bob. It's cheer up Christchurch, because the town has had lots of difficulties lately, as you realise. And so if you think it's bad here, always realise it's likely to get a lot worse elsewhere. So what is not doomed? The posters around the university also said that life is going to end, and it looked pretty dire. So the future is certainly not doomed. Time won't stop, and the Earth is not doomed, at least not for 1 billion years or so. And humanity is also probably not doomed. Even James Lovelock of Gaia fame talks of a few breeding pairs in the Antarctic. So, so what may be doomed? What may be doomed? The world's physical resources, especially energy, are reaching limits. The existing biosphere is degrading. Many people in fragile and marginal environments are doomed. They're already dying at the moment in East Africa and other parts of the world. They're dying in America due to the floods and the cyclones. Resource wars are also dooming more people, and they're also dying as we sit here speaking. Many species are doomed. They're currently becoming extinct at an alarming rate. Freshwater supplies are degrading. Fertile soils are degrading. The other thing I want to talk about is our economic system and our fixation on wealth and growth and GDP, because I also think they're doomed. I don't think they can survive a declining oil supply. In doomsaying, timing is everything. You've got to get your timing right. Prominent doomers who's got the timing wrong in the past, Malthus, he was quite right in terms of population, but he was out by a couple of 100 years. Paul Ehrlich versus Julian Simon. This is the same example that was given in the Auckland talk. Richard Hawke gave this as an example of the failure of doomers. I don't know if you remember this episode, but Paul Ehrlich is Paul Ehrlich, the environmentalist, and Julian Simon, the economist, who's now deceased. Julian was an eternal optimist, and they had a bet back in 1980, and the bet was over a number of minerals. And Paul Ehrlich bet that as things got worse and we got to the limits of growth, that minerals will start to be running out and the price will go up. And Julian Simon said, no, that'll be no problem. The economy will advance. That'll make things easier to get, and so the price will come down. As they bet on 5 minerals, tungsten, nickel, I can't remember the 5, but they made the bet, and the idea was to settle up in 10 years' time in 1990. And so when 1990 came, of course, the price of the minerals had collapsed. And the reason it collapsed was because at that time the price of oil had collapsed. When the bet was made in 1980, the price of oil was at its absolute peak, just after the oil crisis. And so that bet went horribly wrong and did a lot of disservice to people who thought that things were going to get worse. Meadows et al., the Club of Rome report in 1972, again, they said the right things. They didn't get the timing wrong. They, in fact, predicted things were going to unfold badly around about now. But the timing of the report coming out, people have got very short memories, and so they thought that if things didn't collapse in the next few weeks, then the report was wrong. And, of course, they were boohooed. So let's look at the physical resources reaching limits, and in particular the fossil fuels, oil, coal and gas. As you're all probably aware, 87%-ish of world energy supplies come from these 3 fossil fuels. We'll have to also take a very quick look at nuclear and renewables and see whether they can save us. Okay, now the oil data to June of this year shows that for the last 5 years or so that oil production and consumption has been flatlining around about 75 million barrels per day. That's crude. Now, I've been giving talks on peak oil for 5 or 6 years now, but it's sort of been done. I don't need to go any further. The International Energy Agency, the chief economist, Fatih Birol, let's see if this works, gave an interview to Australian television just a few months ago.
This is the headquarters of the International Energy Agency. It puts together all the forecasts on oil production over the next 20 years, and it's the body many governments, including our own, look to for accurate advice.
This multi-government agency is the voice of the mainstream, and I'm here to meet the man at the top.
Dr. Julian,
Who just 5 years ago was confidently saying oil production will rise to 120 million barrels a day by 2030. But now?
When we look at the oil markets, the news are not very bright. We think that the crude oil production has already peaked in 2006.
Hang on. Did you get that? Crude oil production for the world peaked in 2006.
The existing fields are declining sharply in North Sea, in United States, in Gulf of Mexico. Just to stay where we are today, we have to find 4 new Saudi Arabias. This is a tall order.
There we go. Okay, so I don't have to give peak oil talks anymore. After fighting the International Energy Agency for the last 5 or 6 years, they finally admitted it. Peak oil has passed. But it's not synchronous. Developing countries are generally increasing their consumption, whereas the rich countries are declining or decreasing. This is a graph put out recently on the oil drum. This is all the countries in the world that are increasing their oil consumption. And they include China, India at the bottom, Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, of course, Brazil. The only 2 developed countries in that list is Norway up here, and somewhere in there is Australia. Okay, so all the other ones are right down the bottom. Yeah, all the other ones are developing countries. If you look at the countries which are declining or static, they're all the rich countries. US, Japan, Germany, South Korea at the bottom, all the way up, and I've highlighted New Zealand up here in the top. So whereas we've reached peak oil, some countries have reached their peak sooner than others, and it's generally the rich countries that are declining and the poor countries which are still increasing. Colin Campbell, who I spent study leave with 5 years ago now in Ireland, he said that we would have reached peak oil in 2010, and he's also calculated that we'll reach peak gas in 2020. So this is all oil here, this is last year, and peak gas. It's a bit hard to see there because it's a stacked graph, but if you unfold it, it comes out to be about 2020. Okay, so I don't have to say anything more about oil. It's already been said. So what about coal? There must be lots of coal. Everyone says so. Okay, but if you look at the coal data, the sorts of geological information on it is quite old. It was mostly done in the 70s and 80s. New Zealand's main exploration was done in the 1980s. A group called the Energy Watch Group from Germany have done a similar analysis for coal as the oil people have done for oil. And they find that peak coal is likely to occur around about 2030. Okay, now their prediction for the peak at around about 3.5 billion tonnes per annum is now outdated. We've exceeded that. Very recently, just last year, a paper came out in Energy Policy which did a Hubbert type analysis on coal, which showed that peak coal will occur this year, 2011. Okay, now I find this one a bit strange. It's a very narrow peak, and it's not supported by the evidence in terms of what's happening in the coal industry. A more realistic report has come out by a Chinese-American, Ming Li, from the University of Utah, who's done a separate analysis for the rest of the world and for China. The reason being is that the Chinese information has been very difficult to get from mainstream, so the previous reports didn't include Chinese-owned Chinese coal data. And so what he's done is looked at graphs for production for the rest of the world and for China. And he gets a peak for both of them around about 2027. Okay, China's coal consumption as of 2 years ago now was equal to the whole rest of the world. So the half of the world's coal production and consumption comes from China. This year they will have exceeded the rest of the world production and consumption. They're likely to reach a peak of around about 5 billion tonnes per annum in around about 2027. Okay, and to just show you the enormous growth, they're growing their coal consumption at around about 8.5% per annum. That's a doubling time of about 8 years. So in 8 years' time, China will be using as much coal as the world does presently. They're not going to be able to go much more than that, though. Once they reach that, they're up around about 3.5 now. They're likely to get to 5 or 6, but after that they will peak. And you can see what the problems that will occur, not only for their own economy, but also for the world's climate. Coal, the problem with increasing consumption is, of course, the greenhouse effect and climate change. And I hope most of you here went to see Jim Hansen when he came to Christchurch a few months ago. Jim Hansen has written a book, Storms Are My Grandchildren. He disagrees only slightly with the IPCC, suggests that the safe part of CO2 in the atmosphere is 450 parts per million, but it's parts per million equivalent. That's what the little E means there. So that includes the nitrous oxides and the methane and everything. Jim Hansen said that safe limit in the atmosphere is 350 parts per million, but that's straight CO2. If you convert this one to CO2, it's around about 390, 400 parts per million. So the disagreement's not actually that big. If we get higher than that, then the temperature's likely to increase past the 2-degree mark, and we'll reach tipping points, and all sorts of bad things will happen. The present, as of June of this year, the data suggests that the CO2 in the atmosphere is 393 point something parts per million. So we're very close to what the IPCC says now is the limit for CO2 this year. So in terms of climate change, things are looking fairly grim. According to Jim, if we want to keep it down to 350 parts per million, then we've got to get rid of all coal after 2030. Okay, now you saw the graphs before with China increasing at 8% per annum. The Chinese economy is completely based on coal. It's not likely to happen. So that means all coal emissions halted in only 19 years' time. No unconventional fossil fuels are used. So no lignites, no deep sea, no Arctic oil, no coal in national parks, etc. All of those things, the tar sands, the oil shales, they can't be used. Methane hydrates, of course, would be a complete disaster. And only conventional oil used. That means no polar regions, I've already said that. No deep oil off New Zealand. Okay, if any of these are used, then according to Jim, we're certain to go above the 350 parts per million. This is the graph he gives, which shows it all. This line here, the red line, is if we use the Energy Information Agency data, which is close to the IEA data for oil, plus reserve growth, then we get a curve which goes out here, doesn't get down to 350 parts per million before 2150. If we use the sort of conservative amount of oil that's around, then we're likely to get down to around about here, which is still above 350 parts per million. Okay, to get down to 350 parts per million by the end of this century, we've not only got to stop all coal-fired power stations, we've also got to not only use all the world's oil, but we've also got to start sequestering carbon. Okay, we've got to get put carbon back into the forestry and soil. And if we want to get down to 350 parts per million by about 60 or 70 years' time, we've got to stop all oil and gas as well. Okay, now those are, of course, sitting there, you must think that that's, almost, it's impossible. And you're right, it is, it's almost impossible. But if we don't, then we're likely to go past tipping points and climate change will get out of control. And once we get to that point, then there's no point talking about mitigation anymore. Okay, once you reach the tipping point, it's like firing a gun. Once the trigger's gone, then you can't go back. Okay, so then you may as well party and I don't know. It's pretty scary stuff. Okay, and you've all seen the current effects of this. There are fires in Russia, there are floods in Australia, Pakistan, China, and we should add US as well. There are tornadoes, twisters, there's fires in Texas. It was on TV last night. Texas has had the worst droughts ever. They've had fires now for 100 days straight. There are famines in East Africa. There are droughts in various parts of the world, including Australia and the US. So it's all appearing as, it's not, one shouldn't have to preach or to say anything about climate change anymore. People just need to use their eyes and ears. Okay? Unfortunately, people don't like to use their eyes and ears, as I'll show later. So let's go back to energy. What about nuclear? Nuclear at present provides about 6% of the world's energy supply from 450 reactors worldwide. Well, I'm not sure I really need to talk about Fukushima. I was interviewed on the radio and I said that it's pretty much the end of the nuclear industry. There's only half a dozen or so of Japan's 20-ish reactors which are actually working at the moment. Germany's looking at shutting them down. The problems in terms of securing the nuclear fuel for the next something like 250,000 years is just too horrendous to consider. I'm happy to take any questions on that later. So what about renewables? I was quoted earlier this year saying that, and I've been saying for a long time, that if you want to go into renewables, you've got to do it while you've got the oil. You've got to use the oil and the coal and so on to make the renewables, because if you don't, you've got a declining energy supply, but you've also got a declining economy. It's going to be very hard to put them in place. Where did this appear? In that intellectual journal, Mind Food. I was up there with Reese Witherspoon for a very short moment. Okay, I've also done some research work on transferring to renewables, and it can be done. This is some work I did with a student a couple of years ago, a Canadian student, and what we looked at is what it would take to transfer the world to solar energy, just the electricity supply. And we looked at various estimates, looking at the best panels, the worst panels, putting them in the Sahara, putting them in Europe. But we also looked at the mineral resources needed to make the panels. So we looked at the silver to make the contacts, the copper to connect them together. And we had some limits. The limits were that you couldn't go above about 10% of the world electricity supply. And you couldn't go above certain percentages of the world current resources. And we looked at a land area limit of around about 1% of the world land area, or 1.5 million kilometres. That's about five times the size of New Zealand. And we looked at various scenarios for the future in terms of growth rates, ranging from business as usual, which is around about 2.4 to 3% per annum, down to smaller ones, and we looked at steady state scenarios and collapse. And what we found is that we could technically do it. You could technically find enough material. Certainly silicon is not in short supply. And we could supply the current world electricity system reasonably easily. Take about 20 or 30 years to do it, to build all the systems, but it could be done. It would require considerable resources. Take close to 10% of the current world electricity supply, the world electricity supply at the time to make the panels. and it would cost around about 10% of world GDP, which is around about $6 trillion per annum at the moment. But what we found was that material constraints would eventually prevail. If you use silver for panels, we'd start running out of silver in 2 or 3 years. Silver is in short supply. Copper would start running out around about 2027, 2030. Even aluminium and steel, which are normally thought of as plentiful elements, start to run out towards the end of this century, because you need a lot of steel and aluminium to connect it all up together. And just think of it, we're talking about covering something like 6 times the entire land area of New Zealand with something. Structures that have to withstand the wind and the rain, etc. So it can be done. It could go up to around about the world's electricity supply at the moment, but I don't think you could go too much further. So the real question in my mind is whether we're going to have enough money to do that. And what I want to look at now is energy and the economy. Is oil money? Economists, I think money's been around for so long that they think of it as being completely disembodied from real things. But engineers, of course, know that if you've got money and you want to buy things, you buy chairs, a car, a house, a plane trip, it almost inevitably involves energy. If we look at the history of oil and world GDP, in the first part of last century, oil was increasing at around about a little over 7% per annum, and GDP about 4.65% per annum. Then we had the oil crises in the 1980s. This is when Julian Simon bet was made. After that, the world got more efficient. It got rid of this oil-fired power stations. It improved car efficiency, and oil consumption increased after that at only about 1.6% per annum. GDP at around about 3.2%. And this is sort of considered the norm for society. In the last few years, that's not worked so well. Oil consumption, as I said earlier, has flattened off. That's the total liquids now, 85, 86 million barrels a day. The crude oil is around about 76. But GDP kept on going up until the financial crisis in 2008. 2008-ish. So does this mean a decoupling of GDP from oil consumption? There are other graphs looking back in time showing that world GDP is very closely correlated to oil production. When we have a slowdown in oil during the oil crisis, there's a slowdown in the world GDP. The other thing to realise is that during that last 5 years or so, both world debt and coal consumption has been increasing dramatically. If you look at world debt since 2000-ish, it's gone from about $20 trillion to $40 trillion. Remember, world GDP is around about $60–70 trillion. So it's getting up to close to 100% of world GDP. You saw the picture before in terms of Chinese coal consumption. It too has been increasing dramatically in the last 5 years. So I think that's what's powered the economy. That's enabled world GDP to increase over the last 5 years, while at the same time oil consumption has been static or declining. Now what this means is that there's going to be problems in the future if world GDP starts declining. One of my favourite authors, Gail Twyberg from the Oil Drum. Gail's an actuary. She's written on this in a number of occasions, and the world economic system works very well when we've got a growing economy. If we have a debt and we have a growing economy, it's very easy to pay off your debts. If you have a declining economy or a static economy, then the interest starts growing up and debt gets more difficult to pay back. And that, I think, is what's been happening over the last 5 or 6 years. Oil supply has been static, GDP's been static or declining, and so debt's been more difficult to pay back. People like their lifestyle, they don't want to give it up, and so they borrow more. And so we get into this situation of increasing debt. The other reason why we need a growing economy is just to get people employed. If you have technical improvements, if efficiency increases and production efficiency increases, then if you're going to keep people employed, you've got to have a growing economy to keep employing them. And it's generally thought by economists that you need around about 2 to 3% growth in the economy per annum to keep people employed. And you need the financial system needs growth to pay back the debt and interest. And really importantly, aside from all the rich world, the third world needs growth just to survive. They've got a very high increasing population. If they don't have growth in their economy, then the amount of money per person declines, and so people start dying. And that's also happening at the moment. But continuous growth is impossible. This is another nice graph that came out in the oil drum recently. Tom Murphy, a physicist from the US, looked at the consequences of growth forever. Okay, he chose 2.3% per annum. The reason he chose that was because 2.3% per annum means that in 10 years your increase is exactly 10 times. So in terms of my argument, if we wanted to increase at 2.3% per annum, in a little over 200 years, we will need 20% of the entire land surface of the Earth. Remember, in my case, I chose 1% as being a realistic limit. Okay, covering 20% of the world's surface is just totally impossible from a resources point of view. There's not enough copper, steel, etc. to do that. But then he went on, in 400 years-ish, we would have to cover the entire Earth with solar panels. Okay, in 1600 years, which is only time ago from now to the Dark Ages, and we would need the total energy of the sun. Okay, that's not stupid enough. He went on, 2,500 years, we would need the total energy of the galaxy. Okay, there's obviously an argument in stupidity. We just can't do that. Madness, he exclaims. Okay, so what happens when we have a declining economy? We are likely to get what's called nonlinear events. When you have a stable economy and things are increasing, everything's working fine, but when you have a declining economy, you start getting nonlinear events. And this is some work I did for the Dunedin City Council. Myself and Susan Crumdyke and others wrote a report on the effects of peak oil, and in my report I suggested that the biggest problem for the future are going to be not effects of oil declining in terms of not being able to travel around. Okay, obviously that's important, but the most invisible effects are going to be economic effects due to nonlinear events in the world economy. And they originate because of the problems I've just talked about, the problem of paying back interest, the fractional reserve bit of the bank, you put $1 in the bank and the bank lends out $10. These things all tend to get very unstable when people take their money out. You have runs on the bank. Debt and interest also contributes to nonlinear events. And you can see that our whole financial system from that point of view is a Ponzi scheme. The only reason it continues is if we have growth. If we have a decrease in growth, world GDP starts declining, then there has to be a run. There has to be a run on the bank or a run on the world economic system. And when that happens, you're going to get a nonlinear contraction. I use the word nonlinear contraction, it means collapse, but if you say collapse, people get worried. Especially if you say that in Christchurch. Okay, so have people thought about this? A number of reports have just come out in the last couple of years looking at the problem of peak oil and the problem for the economy. This is one, I don't know if you can see it all back there. This is a report which was obtained by the Freedom of Information Act. It wasn't public presented. It was written for the UK government and had looked at the problems that will occur for peak oil. I'll just read some of them out. The immediate ones are transfer of income from the importing countries to the oil producers. But the other ones, short to medium, include higher inflation, increased costs, reduced non-oil demand, downward pressure on GDP, tax revenues fall, falling exports, and the other possible impacts include social unrest, resource nationalism, increased geopolitical competition, wars. Okay, so governments know that these things are in the pipeline, so to speak. Just 2 days ago, the German military, the German army, commissioned a report on peak oil. It came out late last year, in November 2010. But the English translation was only released a couple of days ago. This is a report on the armed forces capabilities written for the German government. And it's a really, really good report. I strongly suggest you read it. I'll read a little bit out of it because I think it's so important. When considering the consequences of peak oil, no everyday experiences and only a few historical parallels are at hand. It's therefore difficult to imagine how significant the events of gradually being deprived of one of civilization's most important energy sources will be. Psychological barriers cause indisputable facts to be blanked out and to lead almost instinctively refusing to look at this difficult subject in detail. And they continue, and the report, in fact, details exactly what I was talking about in terms of nonlinear effects and contraction in the economy. It also reiterated the UK government that the likely problems are going to be wars, social disruption, and economic collapse. Okay, so governments of the world are looking at this. A third report, the Joe report, Joint Operating Experience, a US military report of all the combined services in the US, came out and gave exactly the same conclusions. How am I going for time? So what will happen to oil prices? Okay, I disagreed with Susan Crumdeck and other people in terms of the oil crisis causing the price of oil to go up. I don't think it will happen. And my evidence is a fellow called Saad al-Husseini. Saad al-Husseini was head of technical works in Saudi Aramco, and he spoke to the ASPO conference in Denver a couple of years ago, and he said that there's a ceiling to what the global economy can afford. Roughly speaking, you can get between 5 and 6% of the global GDP spent on oil, and that's the ceiling. Okay, global GDP at the moment is about $60 trillion, so we've got about $3 trillion to spend on oil. That equates to an oil price of around about $120 per barrel. What's the price of oil at the moment? Brent's around about 110, 115. So as the price of oil goes up, the world economy starts faltering, and balance is brought into line with supply, not by increased prices causing decreased demand, but by people being out of work. Okay, so I put together some scenarios for the DCC. I looked at several scenarios, or 4 scenarios for the future. One was if there is a linear interaction. If the economy declines by if oil declines by 1%, then the economy declines by 1%. Economists like linear interactions because they can be modelled easily. And also looked at non-linear interactions where a 1% in decline in oil supply leads to an economic collapse. Okay, once you get into such interactions, then you need systems dynamic modelings and chaos theory. You can't model them easily, and the predictions which you give are quite unpredictable. And that's exactly what the German report said. So let's go back to New Zealand. Is New Zealand ready for peak oil? Well, I think it's going to depend upon whether the outcomes are predominantly the linear interactions or the non-linear ones. Whoops. Well, you saw the other one. For most of time, New Zealand's oil consumption has been increasing, but in the last 6-7 years, that's New Zealand's oil consumption. It's almost dead flat, declining slightly, along with most of the rich world. So what's that done? This is straight out of the energy data file. This is total energy. So total energy for New Zealand has also been constant for the last 6 or 7 years. Okay, now either we're getting really good at energy conservation or something's going wrong. This is New Zealand's GDP. You see it's also flattened off in the last few years. The population is increasing, the blue line. So with a static or declining energy supply and an increasing population, it means our energy consumption per capita has been going down by about 1 1.5% per annum for the last 6 or 7 years. So what are the scenarios we've got for the future? As I said, these are the scenarios I came up with the DCC, but they'll apply to Christchurch as well. An optimistic oil supply decline rate of about 0.6% per annum. That's about the best you can squeeze out of the world energy system. If you find lots of oil in Brazil, deep water oil, 0.6% decline is about as good as you can get. Pessimistic, about 4% per annum. In fact, some reports suggest it could be as high as 7 or 8% per annum. You can either have a world economy reaction which is linear or non-linear. So what do we get? If we have a linear decrease, then efficiency gains and transport reorganisation could mitigate crude oil declines. And it's likely in this event that we won't have too many bad effects until around about 2030. By about 2030, we're going to start running out of coal and gas. Climate change is going to start bouncing in, and so I don't think we could ever have linear reactions past 2030 under any circumstance. But that's about the best we can do. Okay? If we have a linear interaction with the economy but 4% declines, then again efficiency gains could mitigate declines until a bit earlier than before, 2015 to 2020, depending upon when the declines start. But by that time, China and developing economies will be stressed by lack of petroleum supplies, and their economies are likely to collapse. And the world factory collapses, then that's likely to cause nonlinear events in the rest of the world. So that's the second best. If we have highly nonlinear interactions and a 0.6% decline, then it's likely that the oil supply will trigger a slowdown in the world economies, and the world will move to a period of stagnating recessions alternating with periods of recovery. I think that that's what's happening at the moment. If you look at the stock market, that's pretty close. So my favoured scenario is a nonlinear interaction and about a 0.6% decline. The evidence for this scenario has already happened. What follows is a series of peaks and downturns in the world economy. I think that's happening. The really nasty scenario is a highly non-linear interaction plus a dramatic decline in the price of oil, in the amount of oil. That's going to trigger a world depression and necessity for a complete revision of the world monetary system. That's the doomsday scenario. So why have we let the world to get to this situation? Why have we let the world? All these things were predicted back as early as 1950. Hubbard predicted that we'd run out of fossil fuels. The Club of Rome in the 1970s. People have looked at the environmental problems. I've looked at various reasons for this, and that was part of the talk. I thought I'd better throw this one in. The brain development, a brain might be just defunct in terms of being able to cope with the sort of problems we have today. And I wrote a paper on that called The Growth Delusion, which you can explore in more detail. And it appears to me that to solve complex problems such as climate change and peak oil might be compromised by the structure of our brain. We just might not be able to do it. A recent belief in growth parallels our longer belief in religion and may tap into the same areas of the brain. Growth certainly suits big business, and through neuromarketing it gives another level of reinforcement. And in addition, of course, growth is needed by the third world just to survive. Fossil fuels are profitable. 800 billion tonnes of coal in the ground is worth about 40 trillion. And the remaining 800 billion barrels of oil is also worth about $64 trillion. So there are very strong vested interests in making sure that the system goes the way it is. I recently came across the works of Erich Fromm. I don't know if anyone's heard of him. Has anyone heard of Erich Fromm? Writing in the 1970s. We're all old enough to remember him. He wrote a book in 1956 called The Sane Society. I came across it at my mother's house when I cleaned it out over the break. It argued, in fact, this is in the 1950s, that society was in fact insane. And the reasons he gave were war, the economy, The fact that the economy is linked to GDP, and GDP is a lousy measure of growth. And the other main reason he gave was the media and advertising, that the population was filled with mindless trivia, the cheapest trash and sadistic fantasies, he called it. So he thought that society as a whole was insane back in the 1950s. If you look at his same arguments which he put forward at that date and transfer them to today and look at how things have changed, in terms of wars, I did an analysis on the number of wars per annum. Wikipedia counts them. The number of wars per annum since 2000, or since his report, have increased slightly. The number of killed has increased dramatically in terms of civilians, and we now have thermonuclear weapons, drones, and all the rest of it. The economy is now out of control in Europe. Greece is on life support. US is deadlocked. This was a few weeks ago. That's been solved now. But the US has still got problems. The media and advertising, the Murdoch circuits hit the road. We've got 3D television. We've got neuromarketing. Things have increased by at least a couple of orders of magnitude since the 1950s. So I think the real question, and this is, I think, getting to the finish, is to ask whether people are actually capable of independent thought. Can we resist the media, neuromarketing, global advertising, the war machine, the growth economy, and the mindless pursuit of more wealth? And can the rich decrease their consumption to give the poor allowance to increase theirs? Thank you very much.